folks. How we doing? A little human geographers. This is the first of I don't know how many of these online lectures I'm going to be recording and posting to Canvas and just putting out there so that we can still continue to go over key information. You guys can take your midterm roughly around the same time you were going to take your midterm anyway. It's just everything is going to be online, all right, from here until at least what I think the college is saying, April 13th, maybe. That's just where we're at. The key is going to be flexibility here and yeah, see what happens over the next few weeks. This is weird. I'm not going to lie to you that this feels ridiculous to be sitting here talking to myself. I'm literally in a trailer, in the Mojave Desert, in the middle of a pandemic, speaking into a microphone. It feels very end of daisy. But here we are. And that also, that makes it sound like I'm out in the middle of nowhere. No, I'm still stuck in suburban Southern California. So you may hear car alarms and, landscaping going on and stuff like that. C'est la vie. Hopefully all this stuff will be clear here. Another thing is that it's kind of weird about all this is the first of the lectures that I had not yet gotten to is on population, which is getting into, a whole host of things in here in terms of just numbers of people. It feels very weird in light of all of this coronavirus, COVID-19 stuff, right? Just thinking about people and numbers, and we'll talk about death a little bit, as well as things like natality, which is birth. It's not all depressing stuff, but this is a very geographic thing, right? Not just simply looking at how many people we have in the world, but where these people are. That's key to understanding how a lot of stuff works, and this pandemic is it's a great example of that. And that term pandemic, just that alone is referring to not just a disease, but the fact that it's spreading across the globe at an alarming rate, right? So it's not just that the disease exists, but the fact that it is moving, going from person to person, from country to country, at a rate that is of concern because it is so contagious and it's spreading rapidly. That's a spatial issue, right? So I'm going to talk through the stuff that I'd normally be talking through if we weren't in the midst of a pandemic. And I may, some of this I may just digress and talk about whatever I just read about in the news. Other stuff I may skip through. We'll just kind of go through. I'll point out some key stuff. We'll see how this all happens, right? So let's start. Let's start just talking about people, all right? How many people we have. And let me see if I can get this to work. In my, secret COVID-19 bunker, which I'm in right now, my internet is not the best. Let me see if I can pull this up. It's working. Lovely. So this is from the U.S. Census Bureau, which, the Census Bureau, we're actually in the midst of one of our census gathering periods. We do it every 10 years. So the last time we did one of these was back in 2010. It's 2020 now as I record this. So you probably have gotten some information in some way about the census. The census is simply, it's a way to count how many people we have in this country, right? Figure out where these folks are, and it's used for things like, where to have, extra congressional representatives and services and government funding and things like that, right? We're just counting who's out there. And so this is kind of cool. It's a real-time U.S. population clock as well as a world population clock. And so just watching this, it's just fascinating. Like here in the U.S., roughly 330 million people exist currently. You can see down here we have one birth every 9 seconds, one death every 11 seconds. And so that's how, the way these things are filling, it's kind of, it's morbid as hell. The birth, we have it kind of, growing, like increasing. The death every 11 seconds, it drops. So that's kind of dark. We also have with migration, that's going to affect the amount of people who are technically, in the U.S., right? So it's saying with all of this stuff put together, we gain one person every 23 seconds. And that's what this clock is doing. Now, the world population clock, on the other hand, maybe, we could say that's terrifying to look at these numbers just quickly ticking along here. So we've got roughly 7.6 billion people. And that's, for me, I've got to update how I'm saying this, because I've been saying 7.5, because the last time I checked that's where we were. But you can see how quickly the world's population is growing, right? And so right off the bat, the first question should be like, how do they do this? Do they have somebody just, sitting around counting as new babies shoot out or whatever? And no, this is statistics and estimates and stuff like this. This is fun with math right here, but it's very useful to see, roughly where we are in terms of people in the world. And do we need to panic? No. And we'll discuss like Thomas Malthus in a little bit, looking at he was a guy who wrote about the population explosion in a very quaint way back in 200 years ago, when we had way fewer people. He was panicked, other people have panicked. We don't need to panic, so I'll discuss that. But the Earth technically is capable of supporting these kinds of human numbers. The problem is not every person is impacting the Earth or using resources in the same way. So we'll cover that. But right off the bat, 7.6 billion people in the world. We'll think about that as we're talking about this stuff. So, and to, return here, another thing to think about is that, no, we're not talking about 7.6 billion people all crowded into one area necessarily, right? What we're actually doing when we're looking at population is to not simply look at raw numbers, but to more often look at population density. In this case, this map here, it's, people per square kilometer. Okay, so the lightest green shade there is the least amount of people per square kilometer. It's the lowest population density. And we see stuff like the Amazon rainforest, Greenland, the Sahara Desert, places that are still very wild and rugged and inhospitable. Very few people, if any, live in these areas, right? The next shade of green, 2 to 25, yellow, 25 to 100 people, again, within a single square kilometer, and it continues to work up, right? And so we can see when we look at this that numbers aren't consistently or evenly distributed. We have areas that are empty. We have areas that are, incredibly populous, incredibly full. And it should be no surprise. I mean, we see, the countries that have the biggest population numbers, like India, China, each have roughly 1.5 billion people living there. We've also got, some cities in the area that are heavily populated, right? But if you look at, again, with China, you go over to Western China, it starts to open up where it's not as populous. Here in the U.S., you can see we've got more populous states. And it's not just the raw numbers, but it's also how many people are packed into a smaller area. So we, here in California, have way more people than we'd see in, say, Massachusetts or New York or New Jersey or some of those New England states that have the reds and oranges there. But at the same time, we also have more space, right? So the life we experience, the just, population density that we experience, totally different from some of these other locations. And that can give us a better idea of what, a place is like. Here's an example using Europe, just looking at raw numbers. So in a place like this, Russia, which, if the map looks weird, it's cut off at the Ural Mountains. Russia continues on, but it's just looking at what we consider to be European Russia in here. But they have a huge population. Germany too is high. But Russia just looks like this massive, heavily populated, crowded place. But when we map that same value, but take, population density into account, again, this time using square kilometers, you can see that number drops, or it appears to drop, right? But it's the case that Russia is huge. So of course they have a lot of people in there, but honestly, they're not as, packed in. There's a lot of space, right? You can think of it that way. So you can see the difference between these things. And what this really gets us thinking about is the idea that just raw numbers in general don't necessarily mean anything. We need to put everything into a spatial context, right? Which is what we've been talking about for the whole semester already. We got to think about not just, what's happening, but where it's happening, right? We're not interested in simply how many people there are, end of story. It's where are these people? Where do they live? And, what are they doing to the environment around them, right? That's why when we're dealing with numbers like this, we got to be smart about it. Now, with these population numbers, I think I mentioned earlier, we have people, being added to our population and people being taken out of our population, right? And so the most obvious way in which new members of a population show up is through natality, through being born, right? So little babies, that's what we're dealing with. And the classic way of, studying this and again, trying not to just simply look at, simple numbers themselves, but do something with these numbers, has been to look at birth rate, all right, which is the number of live births per 1,000 people. I think it's technically how it's been done, since we've been using it. There may be fluctuations here and there, but that's the typical rate that you see. So how many babies were born per 1,000 people in an area, right? Because again, of course, a place like California with a lot of people, you're going to have a lot of babies born simply because there are a lot of people, right, to have babies. So, just the number alone might not mean anything. We want to get that birth rate so we can compare it to other locations with relatively smaller or maybe even larger populations, right? So that's why we would do birth rate. But even that isn't the most useful way to go about this. The TFR, or total fertility rate, is typically seen as more useful than birth rate. So TFR is looking at specifically the number of babies that a woman will give birth to throughout her lifetime, right? So like on this map that we're looking at, we've got the TFR and the legend. That lightest orange color is 1 to 2, right? So meaning in this area, on average, a woman will have, somewhere 1 to 2 babies in her lifetime. Now, some, may have 0 babies, whereas others might have 8, right? But it's an average. So some of these TFRs, you'll see it'll be a number like, 1.6 or 3.5 or something like that. It's simply we're averaging out, right? It doesn't mean there was half a baby or something like that. So as we look at this, you can see this pattern that we have, sadly, as we get into development and some other stuff later on in this semester. We'll see a lot of maps that look like this, even if they're mapping different values. But you see, the global north this term we use for, wealthier nations around the world, in this case have lower instances. And then if you look at, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, especially, you see, a higher value here. It's always higher value when it's not something necessarily you'd want it, to be a higher value of, right? So we see, we'll just concentrate on Africa. We have other stuff going on. You can see Afghanistan, also in this orange, that 6 to 8 category. But it means that in these different countries, we have, women are giving birth to 6, 7, 8 babies throughout their lifetime. Okay, so it's as a woman goes through life during her reproductive years, it's the total number of babies she's going to have if we average out with every single woman in that society, right? And so you could ask, well, okay, why is this more beneficial? Why is this better than birth rate? Well, looking at this map, we can start to think about why that is, right? Like, this is an interesting concept here. Why would we have some countries that have higher, numbers here, higher TFR numbers, and others that have lower, right? Typically, this is when, like, at a class, I would turn it over to you guys to think about this stuff. Ask questions. We'd have a stimulating discussion. We can't really do that at the moment. But it's something to think about here, right? Why might a woman, have more or less babies in her lifetime, right? An obvious example would be, simply choosing not to do this. So choosing to, say, go to school, have a career, going off to work. It can be difficult to have have 8 kids and still, have a career, make, money even, and things like that. It can be a challenge in a place like the U.S., whereas in other countries, gender equality might not be, the same as it is here. Women don't have access to, going off to school to do this stuff or whatever, right? And that's not to say that we can say any of these countries with, the orange color here with these higher TFRs have, uneducated women or something like that. We don't want to ever make these broad, sweeping generalizations, but it could tell us something about just society in general. What, women are able to do or unable to do because of whatever reason. Maybe, it's an economic reason. It could be a cultural or religious reason or something like that. Who knows? And so the TFR isn't enough to tell us exactly what life is like for women in a country, but it's enough to get us kind of thinking about this stuff, to kind of start getting us to ask good questions, to get a sense of why is this place different from this other place, right? So in looking at that, think about that. There's some other possibilities for this. Also, sadly, this isn't talking about, how many babies will then grow up and, become, older kids and adults and stuff like that. Just because that TFR is 6 to 8 might not necessarily mean that it's all large families. Some of these babies sadly might not make it. And that's, the reality. We see the Democratic Republic of the Congo, these parts of Central Africa, been areas that have been, at war, in one way or another for decades. Just really, tragic situations. We may talk about that stuff later on. I talk about it more in my world regional geography class, but I mean, that's the reality. Sadly, you have more death as well in this area. So that could help explain why you also have more babies being born, right? So just think about that stuff, but we're going to move on here. All right, in terms of mortality, which is death, right? We have the whole, classic, like with birth rate, death rate, which is how many people die per 1,000 people, and, over a set period of time in say a year, right? And so if we look at these death rates, we see in the global north, most people die of age-induced degenerative conditions, which you can think about for a moment, but that's just a fancy way of saying people get old, right? They die of old age. Their bodies fall apart because they've had a good run. Whereas in the global south, contagious disease is what's going to get you, right? And so with these two terms, I already mentioned global north before, but global north means the wealthy nations of the world, and global south means the poor nations. And it's based on this observation that when you look at where the wealthier nations are, so in here, let me see, my mouse disappeared, but if you look just above this black line here, you can see, the US, Canada, Europe. These are areas where you've had more wealth, historically. And you can see the line dips down to grab Australia and New Zealand. But these are the wealthier nations. And it's about 20% of the countries of the world. And then the remaining 80% are in the global south. Those are the ones that have been, poor. And we'll get into, why we have poor countries, why we have wealthy countries. Honestly, just, you can glance at it. You can basically look at, within the last, handful of centuries, you've got in the global north, those are the countries that have been doing the colonizing. And in the global south, those are the ones that have been colonized, right? And, different histories throughout in these different regions, but that's kind of the general idea. And this I found on, Wikipedia. People have tried to update that, where South Africa gets to join the party, and Singapore kind of get thrown in here. But honestly, it's still more or less the same idea. And one thing, I'll get more into this when we talk about industry and then development and globalization and stuff like that. You can see that China is not part of the global north. We like to talk about their massive economy and this, trade rival and that kind of status, but they haven't yet been brought into this idea of a first world or wealthy or global north nation. And there are a variety of reasons for that. We'll get into it. Some of it is the fact that, there's still a lot of poverty and stuff in China, that even though their GDP is higher, it's not as spread out as in Europe or like Japan or South Korea or some of these other nations here. Other stuff, honestly, is that China freaks some people out, and there's still that, kind of good old fashioned, racism that gets thrown in there, where other countries are allowed to be brought up, others are not. We'll get into China later on, but that's what we mean by global north, global south. And then with this, as we're studying these different things, you find with birth rates and death rates and all these different concepts in here, like this is the whole big data, it's nerd stuff that goes on, fun with numbers and things like that. You can find this stuff all over the internet. This one breaks it down into developing countries and then industrialized, right? And so it's the idea that, again, global north wealthy countries would be industrialized, right? Developing countries, that's global south. And that's another term used, and this one has a bit of hope or optimism loaded into it, right? It's developing. It's not quite developed, but it's getting there, right? It's indicating progress. So developing, like in the upper left here, the annual number of births, you see way more in developing countries than you see in industrialized countries. Way more, babies being born every year in the global south than in the global north. Now that, this goes back to this idea of, are we being honest or responsible with our numbers? Just looking at this, and based on stuff I've already been talking about, why do we have more babies being born in developing countries than industrialized countries? I'll wait. I assume you're sitting at home raising your hand right now. Don't need to raise your hand. Just shout it out. I mean, it's just like in class. You're not shouting out anything, even though you're in a safe space right now as you listen to this. But hopefully, what you're able to piece together is the fact that maybe the reason we have more babies being born in developing countries is we have more developing countries than we do with these industrialized countries, right? Again, it's about 80% global south or developing, 20% industrialized. So to make it look like this, it makes it look like all the poor folks are having babies. And we'll talk about that and some of the issues with that line of thought and that concern. The reality is we just have more poor folks around the world than we have wealthy folks, right? So of course they're going to have more babies. Of course these numbers are going to look higher. Other stuff, though, isn't quite so irresponsible. Some of it can be quite disturbing when you look at, say, like infant mortality rates. Again, and that's, you always get into depressing stuff here, but you see, Afghanistan with 165, and again, it's per 1,000 births, so it's that rate concept, right? So you have 165 for every 1,000 aren't going to make it, whereas in Iceland, it's 2 for every 1,000 aren't going to make it. So we can, using these rates and actually thinking about these more intelligently, you can really get an idea of what's going on in an area, right? We can compare a place like Afghanistan to Iceland, get a sense of quality of life, access to healthcare, for women, who are delivering babies, like all sorts of stuff in there. And in the lower left, I also want to draw your attention to this life expectancy after birth. So developing countries, poor countries, global south, 65 years, industrialized, 79. And remember, that goes back to in the, global north, in the wealthier countries, you're going to die of old age, right? In the poorer countries, contagious disease is typically what gets you, right? And we can think about disease and vulnerable populations and stuff like that in light of this coronavirus. We're going to talk about, life expectancy here in the U.S. specifically in a moment, but that says a lot right there, right? Just what's happening there. It's not that we have different species. We're all humans in these different places, but it's telling you something about the economics, the cultural, society, stuff like that. That's where we can start asking these questions. Why do we have this difference that we see? And here, just in case you're feeling good. In fact, let's go back here. Let's look at this. Look at that. Yeah, we're in the U.S., wealthiest country in the world. Age 79, piece of cake. Now let's look here. Antelope Valley. Here's something I pull out of the L.A. Times a number of years ago now. This is depressing as hell, and more depressing for some of us than for others. But this is showing that in the Antelope Valley, compared to the rest of Los Angeles County, overall, we're really not doing well, right? Compared to just looking, and so looking on the right here, this little graphic thing kind of helps you see what's happening. But it's showing that just when you look at everybody all together, we, live about 3 years less, shorter than everybody else in LA County, right? So just by being here in the AV, you're already, it's like a death sentence. Does that make you feel good? Yeah. This is why we keep telling you guys, transfer. Go to a university. Go, explore, see other places. It could save your life, right? Yeah, that's awful. But then when you break it down based on these 3 racial categories, and honestly, we'll talk about race. It'll be one of the next things I record here. We'll get into that. These categories are problematic, but still, it can be quite useful just to get a general sense of what's happening to certain groups in a society, right? Latinos. I don't know what you're doing, but it's working, right? You look at this just compared to like all of Los Angeles County in general, you guys are living longer than anybody else. Fantastic. Yeah, when anybody tells you that Mexican food isn't healthy for you, you point to this. It's health food, clearly. So yeah, you've got 82.4 in all of LA County, right, in terms of years. But here in the AV, it's still lower than that, right? Living longer than the average here, but still not as good as if you are somewhere else in Los Angeles County. Okay, white folks, I'm not gonna lie, white folks are gonna do fine no matter what. It's kind of about the same in here, but still, right? You've got that 0.8 of a year that you lose if you're here in the Antelope Valley. All right, so white folks can complain, and that says a lot right here. Just looking at these numbers compared to other stuff. But then you look at black residents of LA County in general, and then in the Antelope Valley, and it really doesn't matter where you are, you're screwed, right? Your life expectancy is much lower. But here in the Antelope Valley, that is staggering how much lower that is compared to the rest of LA County, just for on average everywhere else, right? You're going to die a decade sooner than the average life expectancy out in Los Angeles County. And so why is that? There's nothing biological about this or natural about this stuff. And what this piece in the LA Times was getting at was that it's the fact that you don't have access to health care if you fit into some of these groups than if you fit into others, right? So it's saying that, black folks in the Antelope Valley cut off from access to simple health care, stuff that could keep you alive, for another decade, don't have access to that, right? So that's what this is showing. And what's really, terrifying too is that these numbers are closer to, if we go back here, the average in the industrialized world versus these developing countries, for black folks living in the Antelope Valley. You might as well be in a third world poor country, and that's just unacceptable, right? To live in the wealthiest nation in the world and have a certain group of people who are facing this. And this you can see this was from 2012 when this came out. The hope was this would get us really talking about medical care in general, who has access to it, what's an equitable way to make sure everybody has access to this stuff. Yeah, we're still not realistically talking about that to this day, right? But it goes to show when we're looking at these numbers, whether it's natality or mortality or whatever, it's political, it's economic, it's social. These aren't just numbers and kind of dehumanized abstract things. This really does tell us a story about what life is like, right? And so just like being in the Antelope Valley in general, this says a lot of stuff. But this, hopefully, if you're seeing this for the first time, hopefully this is a bit of a wake-up call, gets you thinking about what kind of society we want to live in, right? I'll leave it at that. We'll get too super political. All right, enough. That's way too depressing. Let's talk about sexism, right? Instead of death of an entire racial group of people. Let's talk about how difficult it is to be a lady, shall we? So gender plays a big role. And in this, I'm kind of sloppy with how I use these terms here. Gender is different from sex. Okay, so sex is a biological thing, right? It's the parts you're born with, right? What kind of genitalia do you have when you're born, right? Will determine, are you male or female? And we do have, some exceptions where babies are born without a clearly defined sex. So you will have that take place, but that is a rare thing. But we have, biologically male and then biologically female for the most part. Gender is how you identify, how you present yourself, right? To be feminine or masculine or whatever. We're not going to so much dwell on it in here. There are, of course, you guys have heard all the different discussions about, how many genders are there, or, are there even numbers, or is it some kind of spectrum or whatever? The reality of it is, like, you'll hear people who get all, frustrated and will say, there are only two genders, right? Boy and girl, male, female, whatever. No, that's not the case. And if you even look historically speaking, you can see that, in Western society, whether it's, like I've read histories about, in Britain, where it wasn't about, histories of gender, but you see as you're reading through here that, actually what it meant to be male or female has been a very different thing, within the last, 100, 200 years or whatever. So gender is a very social thing. There's a lot of, social meaning embedded in whether you, appear to be male or female, right? Masculine or feminine. And so a lot of that has been connected to, in the cases of, like, with babies, whether you want to have that son or daughter. So it's you're hoping to get, biologically a male, say, but it's primarily so that, male baby can grow up to be a masculine adult who can take care of you, or, whatever the reason is, right? Same thing for certain jobs. Certain genders are seen as being better at certain jobs, right? It has nothing to do with, what plumbing you have, with what, private parts you've got in your pants. It has to do with how you present from that gender point of view, right? So that's what we're getting at. And that really, this shows up with population. We see that, especially with immigration, you see this movement of, certain genders over others, for specific jobs, right? So, one gender is able to, migrate to another location, all because of this social preconceived notion, this social construct that, women are better at this than men are, or whatever, right? So gender plays a huge role. Okay? With this, a lot of this stuff, it's connected to women, in worse jobs. Basically, it's like men have been seen as being historically better at the better jobs, the ones you would want to have, whereas for women, they get the crappy work, right? Like domestic servants, whether it's maid, nanny, stuff like that, where you'll get women who are able to move to another country, leave their country, go to a new one on some kind of work visa, some kind of, work permit, to work in a house, to be live-in help, right? Maquiadoras, and I don't think I have, we'll talk about this later when we get into industry or globalization or that stuff, but the Maquiadora program, it's an agreement between the U.S. and Mexico to have manufacturing take place in these, I think they're called export processing zones, where they're not technically Mexican nor U.S. soil, kind of a no man's land where these factories can exist. So labor laws of that country don't necessarily exist in there. The Constitution doesn't necessarily go into these places, right? And so we have manufacturing taking place right at the U.S.-Mexico border. We tend to think all this stuff is made in, China or wherever, but it's, a lot of stuff is made, real close to where we are right now, right on the border, right? And what has happened is that to fill these factories, women have been hired, right? Men aren't hired, and it's because men, will complain, they'll show up drunk, they'll want to unionize, stuff like that. Mexican women are seen as being very docile workers. They will come in and do their job and not complain, and you can pay them whatever and all that, right? And so that's the reality. Where in northern Mexico, you have a lot of women who have been able to move up there, get jobs. And again, that it goes back to the gender thing, right? The idea of being docile, about being, able to put up with stuff and all that. That's a gender thing. That doesn't, you can say all you want about testosterone versus estrogen or whatever. There's nothing biological about that following orders or whatever. That's a social practice, right? But these women are seen as being better at that. So they're able to get the jobs there, whereas men can't necessarily get those jobs. And that's led to a lot of issues, socially. There's been, crime has been an issue. Murder, serial murders of some of these women in the factories been a real issue. It's a terrible, terrible thing. But at the same time, televisions have never been cheaper in this country. That's the reality of it. So think about that when you're watching your big, beautiful flat screen television that you bought for, such a tiny amount of money. That's because of these kinds of operations, these maquiladores, because these women are seen as not being worthy of getting paid a living wage. All right, we'll talk more about that later on, but something to think about. And then also, which is so creepy, but in Southeast Asia, specifically places like Thailand, there is a rampant sex industry. Prostitution is seen as just some. It's kind of been seen as natural in some of these areas, that not just women but Asian women make natural prostitutes, which again obviously is complete nonsense. It's a very social thing. A lot of that comes from World War II American and British sailors in the Pacific Ocean. Kind of these ideas kind of become cultivated. But that's another thing where you have your ability to migrate into a better country is only through sex trafficking and all of that. And again, because of these perceptions of not just gender, but race and gender, that this is how Asian women are. It's a bizarre concept. It's depressing and creepy as hell. But that's the reality. That's how gender can play a role here in terms of where people can move and other people can't move, and so on. That's too depressing. Now let's talk about Chinese baby policies. All right, this is also depressing, and you guys have all heard about this. The idea that China, had this policy of one couple, one child, right? And it's not quite the same as it used to be. It's been relaxed a little bit, but it was the result of communist revolution, the Cultural Revolution, and this just irresponsible policies throughout China in the mid-20th century. And you can see here in 1970, China has a TFR of 5.9. They're concerned with overpopulation. The government enforces this policy, pumps the brakes, and you can see by 2004 that TFR goes down to 1.7. And you could say, hey, what's the deal? If it's going to be one child per couple, shouldn't it be a TFR of 1, right? But there have been exceptions. You could get a license to have a second kid. It would cost you, I think, thousands of dollars. It wasn't easy to do, but some people could do that. In rural areas, it was harder to enforce this stuff, and so on. But it was the idea that they did not want to have overpopulation issues, so let's slow this down. And what's extra creepy, it's the propaganda at work, right? When we look at these pictures in here of, this is, okay, we can say this is fine. Just the couple, the one on the top there, looking at the healthy baby. All right. But the one on the bottom, which says one couple, one child, eugenical and well-bred. That's terrifying. Eugenics, right off the bat, that's not a good concept there. And that's this idea of effectively trying to breed humans, to get rid of weak genes, bad genes, inferior genes, and have, a superior human race that comes out of this. That's Nazi stuff, right? And I'd love to say, like, that's the Germans, that's the Nazis. A lot of that stuff started here in the U.S. prior to the Nazis taking control, so we're not immune from that. But just this whole idea of trying to selectively breed humans to get rid of, disabilities and stuff like that, that's creepy. But also what I love too is just this bizarre concept that, it's like the firstborn and the only child is going to be the best genetically. Right? Think about that. And hopefully none of you are younger, brothers or sisters, because clearly we know that's how it works, right? Mom and dad, they have their first kid, all the good genes go in there, and it's just, it's like a copy of a copy as you go down. So you get down to like the third or fourth kid, oh, total garbage, right? No, of course not. That's not how this works at all. But they're showing him with the dad measuring his son, like, oh, look how tall my one child is. Can you imagine if I had to, I don't know, share this height across like 3 kids or whatever? Yeah, that doesn't make any sense at all. And again, it goes to show how social this stuff is, how cultural, how human a lot of these ideas are. So even though we're talking about reproduction, all this biological stuff, it's not really biological what we're looking at here. It's messy human concepts. Sadly, too, with this pressure to have just one kid, that led to wanting to have one specific gender, right? And wanting to have males. And we see this in China. We also see it in regions of India as well, where overpopulation is an issue. But it's very clear, just looking at the numbers. Like this example, in Punjab, 793 girls for 1,000 boys. Statistically speaking, like, flipping the coin 2,000 times, you're not going to get that kind of distribution. It should be much closer together, roughly 1,000 girls for every 1,000 boys, or more girls than boys. But yeah, so that's clearly bad that you're having, late term abortions and things like that when the couple finds out that, it's going to be a daughter, right? Or, infanticide where the baby's born and just abandoned. So it's been dark and awful in the late, 20th century, seeing the results of this, where a family can only have one child. In China specifically, the males are seen as being able to take care of their, parents as they get older, whereas females are seen as not really worth anything. They're going to be a burden. You're going to have to pay some young man to marry your daughter just to kind of take her off your hands, right? So you're hoping to get that son. And that's led to, plenty of babies being abandoned at orphanages, is awful, but also kind of ridiculous. And one good bit of news is that this policy has changed. As I said, China has realized that this has been a bad thing, right? And not from like a, because all babies are wonderful and we should protect them and all that. No, they're realizing that this isn't sustainable. Because what's the reality, right? We go back, 20 years or whatever to where this policy is the case. One kid pushing for having, a boy, if you're going to have that one kid, abandoning the girls or worse. What does that look like today, right? It means you've got a whole bunch of guys and hardly any ladies for them to marry. Now, women are actually having that ability to say, no, I'm not going to marry you. I'm going to wait for somebody I actually like, right? Men are losing power in this case, and that's, of course, what it took to get this to really change. So it's not a perfect story, but at least you do see something good coming from this, right? That it's not quite the case like this anymore. But again, you can see how it's not just, babies. It's specifically babies are gendered already before the child's even born. Whether or not it's going to be male or female, that's going to determine its value, right? Has nothing to do with biology, has everything to do with culture. That's what gender is. Okay. So there's that. Now we'll get into just the idea of going back to kind of numbers in general and what we call the population explosion. All right, and it's the reality that we people be reproducing. All right, that's just how it's worked. And since we showed up, in fact, when did humans show up? I know I've talked about this with you guys. How old are humans? When do we first arise? You're raising your hands? Don't raise your hands. Just shout it out. Perfect. A little over 200,000 years ago. Yeah. So that's when we have the first humans. Where was that again? I think we talked about this. Come on, shout it out. That's right. East Africa. Very good. So yeah, we have humans show up roughly, I think it's like 220,000 years ago, 230, something like that in East Africa. That's when Homo sapiens arise. And then, from there, they start to spread, right? Start to reproduce. We have more and more humans, what we would consider to be modern humans, and start to travel to this place and so on. But for a long time, we're pretty small in terms of population numbers, and we start spreading over the planet. And so we're going along, and it's the idea that we would have a lot of human babies born, but death would occur rapidly compared to today. Early humans would not have lived as long. We didn't understand things like disease, didn't have reliable food supplies. There are more predators out there in the world, stuff like that. But eventually we get to the point where we stop dying as rapidly, where children are growing up to mature adult ages. We have older senior early humans that show up. So we cut the death rate, but we don't necessarily cut the birth rate or the TFR right away, right? And so what this has led to is this, and these are charts that are fantastic, and this one is cute as hell because it's so out of date, but I got it. Like you see, it's 6 billion there in 2000. Those were the good old days. It's 2020 now. You guys remember how many people we have on the planet? That's right, 7.6 billion people. There are different estimates, but it's looking like by the year 2100 will be around 9 billion people. That's the rough guess here. But what we can see is that humans are doing fine for a period of time, and then we just explode. And what that explosion is, it's stuff like the agricultural revolution in England, where we figure out how to grow more food in a place like England, and this idea spreads elsewhere. It's the industrial revolution that will come after that. That industrial revolution goes from England to the rest of Europe, to the US, out to Japan. Like, it starts spreading in different places, and that's when we start to see industrialization take place, right? We start making more stuff, and that leads to more scientific advancements. We start to understand things like germs and the fact that germs are what cause disease, and we learn how to not spread germs, and therefore we don't get sick as much, and we're able to live longer and so on, right? But the issue is, even though we're living longer, it doesn't necessarily mean we're having fewer babies, right? So we just keep reproducing at these rates, and we're not dying off. So this is where we're at here. All right, now this, I saw this online with this whole coronavirus thing, somebody showing this and being like, no wonder we're all going to die now, or whatever. Again, it's nonsense. We're not all going to die. Let's take, good old Tom Malthus here, who really first looked at this. He wrote, this famous, an essay on the principle of population. And for context, he wrote this. This was published in, I want to say it's 1798, okay? Which is right before we had our first billion people on the planet. So right there, think about how cute that is, right? To just have 1 billion people. But you can see, if you look, that's doubled what it was just, a few years prior, effectively. It's pretty remarkable. That would have been terrifying for some folks, and, like Malthus in England. But he writes this talking about population numbers, this population explosion, and he's concerned But you know what? He looks at it, and it's not humans, right? Just like across the board are the problem. It's certain humans. Now I'm gonna lean into the microphone here a little, get a little closer. We can talk a little more quiet because we're in a safe, we're amongst friends here, safe space. We can talk about this stuff. It's poor folks, right? It's the poor people. Those are the ones that are the real problem. And I know again, this is a safe place because I requested that in my cultural geography class, I didn't have any poor students placed in there. I always am very specific with counseling and admissions and records and all those folks not to allow the poor into my class. So that way I can talk freely to you, my, fellow well-off, well-to-do people. But yeah, it's the poor people. And this is what Malthus realizes. He discusses how, when you look at poor people, he has what he calls relaxed morals, meaning they're just garbage. They're not good, God-fearing Christians. They're not just good people in general. Poor people be just having sex and not even caring. And here's the deal. Like I'm not going to be irresponsible in the number of babies I put out in the world because I got a job. Ain't got time for making babies. And even if I'm not at work, I'm doing good stuff. Like I'm reading books to expand my mind, and I'm able to, occupy my time with good stuff. Whereas poor people, they're not even working to start with, right? They're just on welfare or whatever. And they just keep making babies, right? They just keep making babies and babies and babies. Those babies grow up. Those babies, grow up to make more babies, and it just continues. That's the problem. And so what's going to happen is we have more and more poor babies just reproducing and reproducing and reproducing. And then they're going to be taking resources, whether it's food, whether it's clean water. They're going to spread disease. Think about that in light of everything that's going around us, right? It's the poor people who are going to be spreading disease. And we, well-to-do people who are doing the right thing, we're doing everything we're supposed to do, we're going to be affected by this, right? So Malthus, his brilliant idea, get a load of this, is, hey, let's stop helping the poor, right? Enough of these, this charity, right? What we would call, welfare, in society today. But this kind of, welfare that was going on in 1798 in England, let's stop. Because all we're doing is we're prolonging this. We're allowing these poor people to keep making babies and then having, just spreading disease and taking resources and all that. We're going to get to a point where the entire society collapses. I think I have a chart. Yeah, this is how you know it's true because of this chart right here, right? Look at it. I got lines going. So resources. It's the idea, that blue line. It's like, yeah, we can make some more food, find some more stuff that we need or whatever. But poor people keep making babies, and they keep making babies, and they make babies, and so on. And so that explodes, and eventually we get to this point in time where we have more people than resources, this concept of eco-scarcity. We're all going to starve. We're all going to die, and it's all because of those damn poor people. Are you with me? Let's stop helping the poor. Right? Okay, so maybe that's awful to think that way. Maybe Malthus was a complete dick and a horrible, horrendous human being. But what's even more terrifying is how many people still love Thomas Malthus and don't fully understand what it was he was saying. But yeah, he was awful, and his ideas encouraged concepts like these poor laws that took poor families and split them up. Like you take, the man, have him go to this workhouse over here, take the woman, his wife, and have her go to this workhouse over here, all, to physically separate them. Like you would if you're, breeding rabbits or whatever. You physically separate the poor folks, split up these families so they can't keep making babies. I mean, it's just god awful stuff. And the idea was, it's in the name of of making sure we have enough resources to last. Now, I was actually just reading, I just started Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. I'm a little late to the party on this. I don't know if you guys have heard of it or not, but he was actually in the introduction speaking of Malthus as being in the context of the French Revolution, right? So that's 1789. Malthus writes this in 1798. But it's the idea of really being afraid that if we do have too many poor people, they might get upset with the fact that we wealthy people have all these resources and, they might chop our heads off, and we don't want that. So it was kind of written in this guise of it's pure science and just a survival thing. But what Piketty was getting at is the idea that, it's really to make sure that we don't have way too many poor people who then overthrow the wealthy, and the elite in Britain. So that's an interesting thought. But we see, plenty of people love Malthus, but, we equally have plenty of people who attack his ideas. But here's an example right here of how this continues on today. So this is, an editorial cartoon, political cartoon, showing global population with the globe here on this, shrunken, skinny, starved human who's crushed underneath the weight of the globe. And on the human, it says resources, right? So, looking at Mother Earth and all the stuff we get from her. And the caption is Atlas starved, right? This is so awful. Because we're not, it's not global population numbers that are starving the earth of resources, and especially if you look where this is, global population, it's written across Africa, right? With the idea, again, we have more babies being born in these developing countries in the global south. They keep making babies out here. It's, irresponsible, and we never get to the fact that, they do have a lot of babies there, but it's because we have a lot more poor countries, A, and B, we don't really get at who's, using these resources, right? And getting into who has actually the ability to use these resources. Not every human has the ability to drain the earth of resources. So this stuff still shows up, and it's complete garbage. But that's been a battle against Malthus. And early on, we see some people critiquing good old Tom Malthus. We have Karl Marx, Fred Engels. These guys as the Communist Manifesto boogeymen here in the U.S. And we'll talk about socialism and communism and all that later on when I get into political geography. But what a lot of people don't learn early on, until you get to college and you actually start reading books in general, is that a guy like Karl Marx wasn't just writing about, overthrowing the government and revolution and all that stuff. He scientifically studied capitalism. He scientifically studied how capitalism works. He understood it very well, and he was also against it because of what he saw, what it could do. But, he, along with Frederick Engels, are writing, about social issues in here and what's fair and what's just and so on. So they attack a guy like Malthus, who's saying that, all this stuff, poverty and how it's connected to disease and starvation and resources and all that. They're saying we got the resources. It's some are taking more than, others, right? That's the general idea. And there's that, poor law that I was just mentioning earlier, where you have husbands and wives separated. That's in 1834. All in response to Malthus's concerns, right? Trying to, blame the poor for this excess of using of resources, but it's not the case. In fact, let's just skip this. Let's get to some maps here to wrap this up. So this is a cartogram. Okay, so a cartogram is where we take some known location. In this case, it's the different countries of the world, right? But we exaggerate the shapes or the size of these countries based on some value. So this is based on population. So you can see the United States more or less looks like the United States. Mexico more or less Looks like it should. We can recognize that, right? Canada almost disappears. And that's because Canada, I think, you can look this up, but I think they only have 7 people who live there in Canada. I'm pretty sure. I don't know. I don't pay attention. But yeah, so there's that. And then you can see China and India, exploding in size. Russia, teeny tiny right there because it's, a lot of people, but it's spread out over this big area, whereas China, gigantic, right? So if we're going off of this Malthusian concern, we would see places like, in India, China, places with a lot of poverty and also high numbers. You can also see Nigeria in Western Africa is a great example of this too. The concern would be like, oh my God, all these poor people keep making babies here. That's a concern. That's what's going to destroy this planet, whether it's through the spread of the coronavirus or through climate change or whatever it might be. But then, if we look at another cartogram, this time we look at GDP or gross domestic product, we see a different picture, right? We start to see that, oh, okay, this isn't the same. I mean, still, you see Canada hardly there, right? 7 people. Not a high GDP, I guess, as a result, too. And GDP, gross domestic product. I don't think we've talked about this in here, but it's effectively, it's looking at the size of the economy, right? That's a simple way to say it. It gets a little more complex in how it's calculated and all that, but you're just looking at, wealth, basically. How big is that economy? The U.S. is the highest GDP in the world. USA, yeah! And that's why we are this bloated, like we look like we're going to explode, right? Like a tick that's just, consumed too much. And that's what we need to be thinking about. It's not a case of, just pure numbers. Not every human is equal on this planet, right? So like Africa, not just Nigeria, but Africa. Can you even find it, right? I mean, look at that. Look at how that shrinks down. And you can see this is also that global north, global south, comparison here. These northern nations, for the most part, quite obvious where they are. And then the southern nations all but disappear, right? So a place like Nigeria, like we have tremendous population growth there, rapid expansion, a lot of babies being born, but it's also a very poor place. So for all these babies that are born, they don't have the ability to, exploit resources, right? They don't, have access to this stuff to kind of go through it in the first place. So this whole Malthusian concept of, numbers means a problem, just, flat out. And, oh, wouldn't you notice that it's also the poor folks that, there are more poor folks, more poor babies being born than wealthy babies. Well, that has nothing to do with the poor folks. It has to do with the fact that we have way more poor folks around the world, right? So think about that. And we'll see more examples of this stuff. But you can think about going back to our TFR, going back to our relatively small number of a little over 300 million people in this country. Yeah, we're not huge in that sense. But think of the cars that we not only have access to, but we can drive whenever we want to, right? Like we're starting to learn with this kind of quarantining that's going on and this isolation that we're doing, we're going to see that we use a lot fewer resources just because our movement is restricted. We're not going out to eat. We're not just going shopping or whatever. That's a good thing in terms of resources. It also kind of drives us crazy, right? But it kind of goes to show that the more money you have, that's the real problem. That's how you really impact resources and stuff around the planet. All right. Hopefully that made sense. And then, this is too depressing. This is more about how we're all going to die. Let's skip that. Now, what I normally do with this is that whole mental map thing that assignment that some of you guys have already been bugging me about. We're not going to do it. So don't worry about it. So we'll skip this thing here. Okay, we're done with this stuff. Let me know. Communicate with me through email, through the Canvas email thing or normal email or whatever. If you have any questions about this or other stuff or whatever. But in the meantime, I'm going to stop recording this. upload it, get it to YouTube, link it to Canvas, like do all this stuff, and hopefully this will work out. I imagine by like the 10th one of these I have to record, I'll finally figure out what I'm doing, and it won't sound awkward and weird. All right, that's it for now. Enjoy, my little geographers. Stay safe out there, and I will talk to you soon.